Good morning, my name is Mason, and this is day 19 of the Advent devotional. So I want you to think of a time when God was faithful in your life, a time where God kept his promise. And this can look 1,000 different ways. It could be a time where God answered a prayer or a time that God provided exactly what you needed at the right time. And so this morning, I want to talk to y'all about this conversation between God and David. So looking back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, God tells David that through his family, he would build a kingdom that would endure forever. This kingdom that would last forever. So David continues as king, and eventually his time on earth would end. And I think it's very easy for us to think that our sin could bring us too far from God, that his promises won't be kept if we're too sinful, that our sin causes God to not want to be faithful. But I want you to hear this today, that even though we're all sinners, God is still faithful. So looking all the way back into Matthew chapter 1, we see all of Jesus's ancestors, starting with Abraham and ending with Jesus. And we all know Abraham, and God had this conversation that through his family, he would bring the rescue of the world, talking about Jesus. But at the end of this chapter, verse 17, it talks about how there's 14 generations from Abraham to David. And then after David, there's another 14 generations from David to Jesus. So we see 28 generations of people who are living after God, who are faithfully living their lives. And this wasn't just a couple of months that they lived faithfully. It wasn't a couple of years, but it was their entire lives. They lived faithfully for their entire lives. And I'm sure that doubt crept in, that they were thinking God isn't going to keep his promise, that God isn't faithful to what he says. So even though it was 400 years of God being silent, God never spoke to the people. In the silent, God was working and preparing the first Christmas. He was preparing the day that his son would come down to earth and live his life. And I think it's important that we're mindful of knowing that in the stillness, in the quietness, God is still working. And we see 28 generations growing stronger in their faith, remembering, holding fast to what is true about God being faithful. So at the end of the lineage, we see this man named Joseph, and he ends up with Mary, and they live lives faithfully. They kept to the promise that God will bring home the Messiah. And eventually this angel appears to Mary, and he says, "You will have a baby, and you will name him Jesus." So it would be easy for us to think that God had forgotten about us, or that God was not going to keep his promise. But I want to tell you today that through the Christmas story, through the birth of Jesus, we are reminded that in the quietness, in the stillness, God remains faithful. What would it look like for our lives to be hopeful that God is still a promise keeper, even in the silent? How would our lives change when we know that in the quiet, God remains faithful? Well, I'm so glad y'all tuned in. Y'all have a good day.